I have an associate's degree in game art and design because it's all I could afford without going into debt. And while so far it has turned out to be practically useless, it has afforded me the opportunity to learn a whole ton of industry standard programs, and of course several different game engines. A game engine is essentially the backbone of a video game. It's a collection of back-end systems that bring art assets and functionality together to form a game, and they make it significantly more efficient to develop and run games, as opposed to just hard-coding everything. You can either make your own custom game engine, which is super difficult and takes a lot of time, or you can just use the pre-made one like Unreal Engine or Unity. In fact, it's because of the accessibility of these commercial game engines that they've become the preferred method of developing games across both the indie and the AAA scene, with by far the most popular game engine being Unity. And for good reason. It's essentially the Swiss Army knife of game engines. It's great at both 2D and 3D, it's super scalable, and it has a quite decent learning curve to boot. A steep one, sure, but it's got many stepping stones along the way, which makes it easy, especially for newer game devs, to learn it and get used to it, which contributes to it being the game engine of choice for anywhere between 38 to 60% of games, including 70% of mobile games. Needless to say, it's an industry standard, which is why my college taught it to me more than any other engine, and at first I was super excited to learn it and become this super successful indie game dev in the future. At least until I did some research into Unity Technologies itself and found out that the CEO was John Riccitiello. And upon learning that, I lost all interest in learning Unity and instead vowed to learn Unreal Engine. Because, to put it simply, John Riccitiello is the worst CEO in the video game industry. For context, he is the former CEO of EA. For even more context, he was the CEO of EA when it was voted the worst company in America 2 times in a row. Riccitiello first joined EA as president and COO in 1997 and remained so until 2004 when he left the company. And to be fair, this period in EA's history is undeniably their peak, with them publishing games like the PS1 version of Diablo, Dungeon Keeper, Road Rash 3D, the Medal of Honor series, SSX Tricky, NASCAR Thunder 2004, FIFA and Madden back when it was good, SimCity 3000, and of course, The Sims, which was one of the most critically and commercially successful computer games of all time. It's funny to think that at one point, EA was a well-respected publisher, not just among other publishers, but among consumers as well. But unfortunately, it didn't take long in the new millennium for the controversies to begin. As far back as the early 2000s, EA already started to become infamous for buying smaller game studios, gutting them of their talent and IP, and then either merging or shutting them down. From Bullfrog Productions to Origin Systems and Westwood Studios. Not to mention concerns of crunch time being kind of a normal thing, which led to 2 different class action lawsuits. And come 2007, EA was in need of a little shakeup in order to fix these problems with the company. And that shakeup came in the rehiring of John Riccitiello, this time as CEO. And when he became CEO, he apparently made this big show of promising that EA would treat their employees and their studios better going forward, only to fail miserably on both fronts. While at first there were plenty of reforms in employee treatment and company structure that, according to EA's own questionable internal employee surveys, did prove to be a nominal step in the right direction, there were still stories of long hours in the company that unfortunately have become widespread in the industry as a whole. And as for the studio shutdowns, well, the closure of Maxis in particular hurt quite a bit, considering that they were the ones who made The Sims. But unfortunately, after years of development hell, their next major game, Spore, turned out to be a decent, albeit disappointing game that drove the legendary game designer Well Wright to leave Maxis in 2009. And while I personally grew up with Spore and consider it to be one of my favorite childhood games, its incorporation of DRM soured the experience quite a bit, as it wound up being quite punishing to paying customers, allowing for 1 registration and 5 installs per disc. And unfortunately, this kind of heavy-handed DRM would become a trend for EA, with it culminating in the absolute disaster that was SimCity 2013. This was around when I first started really getting into the internet, and I distinctly remember just how much shit this game got at launch, and for good reason. Not only was it a huge downgrade from the previous SimCity releases, it also required players to always be online and connected to their servers in order to play, even in single player. And if you lost connection during play, you'd be booted out and you would most likely lose your progress. And at launch, the servers clearly weren't equipped to handle the load of a new SimCity game's worth of players, so you'd be lucky if you could even play at all. And this whole online-only DRM fest was mandated by EA in an attempt to curb piracy, only for it to end up being one of the worst game launches in history. And of course, they shut down Maxis 2 years later, effectively blaming them for their own bullshit. And it was pretty much because of this launch, on top of all the recent studio closures, their insistence on putting microtransactions in full-priced games, and the absolutely insulting original ending to Mass Effect 3, EA ended up winning the Consumerist's Award for Worst Company in America 2 years in a row. You could argue this award doesn't mean much as it's based on consumer votes rather than actual research, and that there have been far, far worse companies in history and in present day, but I think it goes to show just how pissed off people were at EA during this time. At this point, EA had become the biggest villain in the video game industry, and a clear example of how runaway greed can ruin everything. But most importantly, it represents a failure in John Riccitiello's leadership. He was supposed to fix the burgeoning issues with EA's culture and structure, and then in the process only proceeded to shut down the most beloved studio, lay off literal thousands of employees after putting them through crunch time, and ruin multiple well-respected game series. So it was no shock when just weeks later, after the launch of SimCity 2013, John Riccitiello resigned from his position as CEO of EA because the company didn't meet their quarterly goals or something. From there, Andrew Wilson would become CEO, and EA would only continue to prove itself as the greediest and scummiest publisher in the industry, among other greedy and scummy publishers. As for Riccitiello, he would go on to become the CEO of Unity. Yeah, Unity Technologies actually thought this guy would be a perfect fit for their indie dev-focused game engine. What could possibly go wrong? Well, to be fair, it did take some time for things to go downhill. If anything, for the first 8 years of Riccitiello's leadership, Unity became a huge success. The release of Unity 5.0 in 2015 was a huge step forward in accessibility for the engine. Arguably too much, as I remember several people complaining about the influx of low-effort Unity games flooding Steam, to which John Riccitiello gave an uncharacteristically based response, stating, "Yeah, that's just a side effect of making our engine accessible to indie devs and shit." And as much as I don't like Riccitiello, I have to say, Unity under his leadership truly was a success story for the longest time. He did a great job in getting Unity to become the #1 choice for aspiring game devs. At least until they switched to a subscription model for their paid version. The Pro version costs $125 a month and has a bunch of features that in all honesty aren't very necessary or even useful to most indie developers. So no one really bought Unity Pro at first, as the free version is practically fully featured already. So, Unity decided to force people to buy Pro. If you made more than $200,000 a year from your Unity products, you had to subscribe to Unity Pro. Not to mention that as of 2021, you needed to have Pro regardless of your income in order to develop for game consoles. Also not to mention the price increasing to $150 in 2019, then to $185 in 2022. Keep in mind, you used to be able to pay a one-time fee of $1,500. Now you have to pay $2,000 per seat a year. And speaking of 2022, yeah, let's talk about 2022. Garbage year all around, really. Ukraine war, inflation, shrinkflation, higher rent, tech layoffs, you name it. And of course, none of that was helped by the fact that Unity started to fall off. It all started with Apple's iOS privacy policy updates in the beginning of the year, which heavily affected Unity ads and thus their bottom line considering their stranglehold over mobile games. This, on top of the silent depression, has led Unity's shares to nosedive earlier in the year, which drove them to make some panicked, controversial, and stupid decisions, like laying off more than 200 employees or them purchasing ironSource, an adware company infamous for at one point apparently packaging malware in with their products. And if that wasn't enough, Unity decided to twist the knife further with the introduction of the Runtime Fee in 2023, one of the most ridiculous, idiotic, confusing, convoluted, and downright bonkers decisions I've ever seen a multi-billion-dollar company make, and that includes YouTube. Simply put, every time someone installs a Unity game onto a new device, not buy it, but install it, the developer has to pay a 20-cent fee. And if someone installs a game on multiple platforms, say one on their desktop and another on their Steam Deck, the dev has to pay this fee for both. Even if the game in question is free, or is part of a charity bundle or something, the dev still has to pay this fee for every single install. They did have a 200,000 install threshold before you had to pay, but it's completely separate from the $200,000 threshold for Unity Pro, which by the way is still a thing that you have to pay for on top of the runtime fee. And then you have Unity games on Game Pass, which over 30 million people have. That could potentially be millions of installs that Unity was going to try and charge Microsoft for, which, yeah, good luck with that, buddy. And not even to mention piracy. Do you have to foot the bill every time someone installs an illegal copy of your game? I mean, they say they have data and shit that can help detect fraud installs, but they don't really explain how this data works. And for all we know, it won't work, and we'll have to debate with Unity on a case-by-case basis, which is simply infeasible. And from the sounds of it, especially with Unity pulling some shady moves with the TOS, this fee may also apply retroactively to games previously made and released with Unity. But hey, if you subscribe to Unity Pro for $2,000 a year, you get a higher install threshold and discounted rates. Just absolutely brilliant. Even though they've walked most of this nightmare back, they've still proven that they're no longer the indie-focused game engine they once claimed to be, right? The trust is gone now, and everyone is pissed off at them. Indie devs, larger devs, wannabe devs, YouTubers, even fucking brackies rose from the dead to completely condemn this scummy move, which, if there's any silver lining, brackies may come back to make Godot tutorials, but yeah, everyone is angry, including me. I literally spent 4 years of my life and thousands of dollars begrudgingly learning Unity for college, only for me to not be able to use it anymore under pain of going bankrupt. Like, there's no reason to use Unity anymore. Despite how much of a jack-of-all-trades the engine is, the company has proven to be untrustworthy, as you'll never know when they'll try and steal even more of your hard-earned income. Not to mention, John Riccitiello is the CEO of this company, and I do not deny for a second that this was all his doing. Yeah, it is true there are other corporate heads behind these terrible business decisions, not just in Unity, but in EA as well. And don't think for a second that Unity will suddenly be great again after Riccitiello's apparent retirement. But, as much as I hate to quote Kevin Spacey here, the first rule of leadership is that everything's your fault. And Riccitiello, being the CEO, is a leader among leaders, right? It's his job as chief executive officer to execute all of the business decisions agreed upon by the board. And he's the one who has to answer for when the company screws up, especially when said screw-ups screw up an entire industry. And I mean, what do you expect from Riccitiello anyways? The man who, as EA CEO in 2011, pondered the idea of charging players a whole $1 to reload their weapons in Battlefield. The man who, as Unity CEO in 2022, when he was questioned about the ironSource controversy, called creative game developers f***ing idiots, his words not mine, for not monetizing the shit out of their games, or working on their compulsion loops, as he called them. What do you expect from this man when he keeps saying out-of-touch, dumbass things that prove just how anti-consumer, anti-developer, anti-everything but himself he is? When you have an executive who's been at the helm of now 2 major corporations in the video game industry during their lowest points, who've made decisions that have done nothing but put people out of work, studios out of business, and consumers out of fun, is it any wonder why people don't trust him? And as much as I hate being that guy, I saw this coming from a mile away when I first found out he was CEO in 2018. Because even back then, and especially now, John Riccitiello is the worst CEO in the video game industry. And you're gonna argue that some execs are technically worse, whether they're terrible at their job or they're just terrible people. But in terms of how destructive one CEO can be to an entire industry, Riccitiello takes a golden turd. and I hope he stays retired.